While I was hunting corporate hackers overseas, my father sold my custom sports car to fund my sister's luxury vacation. When I walked through the door, my father raised a glass of expensive champagne and sneered that, thanks to my car, his favorite daughter was having the time of her life. My sister laughed and said the car was supposed to be hers anyway. I did not scream. I chuckled. She snapped and asked what was so funny. I smiled and asked if they wanted to hear a secret. I watched their faces turn pale as I revealed exactly what they had stolen. The rain was pouring hard when my Uber pulled up to the sprawling brick estate in Potomac, Maryland. I had spent an exhausting month in London leading a cybersecurity conference. My luxury high-rise was undergoing parking renovations, so I had parked my custom Porsche 911 Turbo S in my father's secure garage. I bought it in cash for $250,000. I pressed the code on the keypad. The heavy metal door slowly began to rise. The garage was completely empty. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but then I noticed the security system was still fully armed. The only people who had the code were me and my father Desmond. I marched toward the main house. The sound of clinking glasses and loud laughter echoed from the formal living room. The scene made my blood boil. My father Desmond was lounging in his leather armchair, pouring a fresh glass of vintage champagne. My younger sister Jasmine was sprawled across the velvet sofa admiring a flashy engagement ring. Sitting next to her was her fiancé Connor. He was a white man from a supposedly wealthy old money family, and he always looked at me with a condescending smirk. Tonight was no different. They were celebrating. My father looked up and saw me standing in the doorway dripping wet. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and smiled. "You are back early, Gabrielle," he said casually. I ignored his greeting. My voice was dangerously calm. "Where is my car?" Jasmine rolled her eyes. "God, Gabrielle, you just walked in the door and you are already ruining the mood. We are trying to celebrate here." I locked eyes with my father. "Where is my car?" Desmond casually swirled the champagne in his glass. "You do not need to use that tone with me in my own house. If you must know, I sold it." The words hit me like a physical blow. You sold a car that does not belong to you. A car that is registered entirely in my name. Connor let out a short, arrogant laugh. "Do not be so dramatic, Gabrielle. It is just a car. Your dad handled it." My father puffed out his chest. "It was collecting dust. You were out of the country playing boss lady on your little computers. I found an online buyer who was willing to pay cash fast. I forged your signature on a proxy form. I sold it for $80,000. I literally gasped. "You sold a custom $250,000 vehicle for $80,000. Jasmine sat up and glared at me. "Why are you so greedy? You have plenty of money from your tech business. That car was way too flashy for a computer nerd like you. I needed the money for my engagement trip. You sold my car to pay for her vacation." Desmond slammed his glass down. "Do not act like you are the victim here. Jasmine is marrying into Connor's family. They expect a certain standard. You owe this family. Now it is your turn to sacrifice so your sister can step into the elite world she deserves." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect me. My father ran a failing real estate brokerage. He hated that I built a highly successful cybersecurity firm without his help. Meanwhile, he treated Jasmine like a goddess, simply because she knew how to flatter his massive ego. She was an aspiring influencer who refused to get a real job, and now he was stealing from me to fund her delusions. I clenched my fists. "You committed grand larceny. You committed forgery. I am calling the police right now and reporting the vehicle stolen." Jasmine jumped up, her face twisted in anger. "You would really send your own father to jail over a stupid piece of metal. You have zero family loyalty. You are just bitter because I am marrying a wealthy man and you are entirely alone." Connor wrapped a protective arm around her waist. "You are acting completely unhinged. Jasmine is about to become a Harrington. She cannot be seen driving around in an Uber like a commoner. The least you can do is supply the transportation budget. You consider grand theft a minor inconvenience." Connor smirked and reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He quickly scribbled some numbers, tore the check out, and tossed it onto the floor right at my wet shoes. "There is $10,000. Go buy yourself a sensible used Honda and stop ruining our evening." Desmond pointed a finger at my face. "You are going to pick up that check. Then you are going to log into your portal and officially sign the title transfer. If you refuse to cooperate, I will personally throw out every single box of your late mother's belongings that you have stored in my attic." They stood there looking at me with absolute triumph. They thought I was just the quiet, boring scapegoat who would swallow the abuse to protect my mother's memory. They thought they could bully me into giving up a fortune to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. I looked down at the check on the floor. I looked at Connor's arrogant white face. I looked at Jasmine's entitled sneer. And then I looked at my father's greedy eyes. I did not scream. I slowly reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I let out a low, dark chuckle. Jasmine crossed her arms. "What is so funny? Are you having a mental breakdown?" I smiled, tapping a few buttons on my screen. "You sold my car for $80,000 to some random guy on the internet, right? Do you want to hear a secret?" My father frowned. "What are you talking about? Just sign the damn transfer." I swiped my thumb across the screen. "You see, Dad, I build cybersecurity systems for financial institutions. Did you honestly think I would buy a $250,000 vehicle and not install my own custom tracking system? It records audio, video, and GPS locations 24/7. It cannot be disabled. And it tells me exactly where my car is right now." Their faces turned completely pale. While I was across the ocean, tracking corporate hackers, my father sold my custom sports car to fund my sister's luxury engagement trip. When I walked through the front door, he raised a glass of expensive champagne and sneered that thanks to my car, his favorite daughter was going to experience true high society. My sister laughed and claimed the car was too flashy for me anyway. I did not scream or throw a fit. I simply chuckled. She snapped and demanded to know what was so funny. I smiled and asked if they wanted to hear a little secret. I watched their arrogant faces turn completely pale as I revealed exactly what they had just stolen. The black town car pulled through the iron gates of my father's estate in Potomac, Maryland. I had just spent a grueling month in London leading a global cybersecurity conference, and all I wanted was to pick up my car and go home to my own quiet penthouse. My building parking garage was undergoing extensive renovations, so I had parked my custom-built Porsche 911 Turbo S in Desmond's secure garage. I paid $250,000 in cash for that vehicle. It was my reward for securing my firm's biggest corporate contract to date. I typed the security code into the keypad outside the garage doors. The heavy metal slowly hummed open. I stood there, my suitcase handle gripped tightly in my hand, staring at an empty concrete floor. My stomach dropped. For a fraction of a second I thought I had opened the wrong bay. But the security system was fully armed. There were no signs of forced entry. The only other person who possessed the access code was my father. I bypassed the keypad for the mudroom and marched straight toward the main house. The sound of clinking crystal and loud triumphant laughter echoed down the marble hallway, spilling out from the formal living room. It made my blood run hot. I stepped into the doorway and took in the scene. My father, Desmond, was lounging in his favorite wingback chair, pouring a fresh glass of vintage champagne. My younger sister, Jasmine, was sprawled across the velvet sofa, holding her left hand up to the light to admire her engagement ring. Sitting right beside her was her fiancé, Connor. He was a white man from a supposedly old money family, and he had a habit of looking at me with a condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. Tonight that smirk was practically painted on his face. They were celebrating. My father looked up and saw me standing in the doorway, my suitcase still in hand. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and smiled. "You are back early, Gabrielle," he said, his voice entirely too casual. I dropped my suitcase. The heavy thud echoed against the hardwood floor. "Where is my car?" Jasmine let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes. "God, Gabrielle, you just walked in the door and you are already ruining the mood. We are trying to celebrate my engagement here." I kept my eyes locked directly on my father. "Where is my car, Desmond?" He swirled the champagne in his glass, completely unbothered. "You do not need to use that tone with me in my own house, if you must know I sold it." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stepped into the room. "You sold a car that does not belong to you. A car that is registered entirely in my name." Connor let out a short, arrogant laugh. "Do not be so dramatic, Gabrielle. It is just a car. Your dad handled the logistics. My father puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive but slightly outdated suit jacket. It was just sitting there collecting dust in my garage. You were out of the country playing boss lady on your little computers. I found an online buyer who was willing to pay cash fast. I forged your signature on a proxy form and transferred the title. I got $80,000 for it. I literally gasped, staring at him in sheer disbelief. You sold a custom $250,000 vehicle for $80,000. Jasmine sat up abruptly, her face twisting into a nasty glare. Why are you always so greedy? You have plenty of money from your little tech business. That car was way too flashy for a computer nerd like you anyway. I needed the money for my engagement trip. I turned to look at my sister. You sold my car to pay for your vacation. Desmond slammed his crystal glass down on the side table. Do not act like you are the victim here, Gabrielle. Jasmine is marrying into Connor family. They are high society. They expect a certain standard of living. You owe this family. You moved out the second you turned 18 and left us to fend for ourselves while you hoarded all your wealth. Now it is your turn to sacrifice so your sister can step into the elite world she deserves. They are going to the Maldives and she needs to look the part. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is for me to have a daughter who acts so selfishly when her own blood is trying to secure a future? You should be thanking me for handling this mess while you were away. I stared at the man who was supposed to be my father. He ran a failing real estate brokerage and spent every waking moment pretending he was richer than he actually was. He deeply resented that I had built a highly successful cybersecurity firm completely from scratch without a single dime or ounce of help from him. Meanwhile, he treated Jasmine like absolute royalty simply because she knew exactly how to flatter his massive ego. She was an entitled, aspiring socialite who refused to get a real job, constantly draining his accounts to buy designer bags. And now he was literally stealing from me to fund her delusions of grandeur. I clenched my fists at my sides, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You committed grand larceny. You committed forgery and identity theft. I am calling the police right now and reporting the vehicle stolen. I am pressing charges against you, Desmond. Jasmine jumped to her feet, pointing a manicured finger at me. You would really send your own father to jail over a piece of metal. You have zero family loyalty. You are just bitter because I am marrying a wealthy man and you are entirely alone with your laptops. Connor wrapped a protective arm around her waist, looking at me as if I was something he had scraped off his shoe. You are acting completely unhinged. Jasmine is about to become a Harrington. She cannot be seen driving around in an Uber like a commoner. The least you can do is supply the transportation budget for our honeymoon. In my world, family takes care of each other without calculating every little cent. Be grateful I am even allowing you to attend our engagement events after this pathetic display. I deliberately stepped right over Connor and his very pathetic check. The crisp paper stayed on the floor. I walked straight toward the massive 85-inch smart television. Desmond opened his mouth to shout another order, but I completely ignored him. I swiped my thumb across my phone screen and bypassed the home network security. A soft chime echoed through the room as my phone synced directly to the television screen. Jasmine let out an exasperated groan. She told me to stop playing with my little tech toys and just sign the legal documents. I kept my eyes locked on the television. I tapped a secure application icon on my phone. The entire television screen went pitch black for a moment. Then, lines of code rapidly scrolled down the monitor, followed by a highly detailed satellite map. He demanded to know what I was doing to his television. I calmly explained that military-grade security systems do not just beep when someone breaks a window. They monitor every single metric of the vehicle. I tapped another button on my phone. A bright red dot began pulsing on the digital map. I told my father that my car was not with some random online buyer. The vehicle was completely stationary. Connor scoffed loudly. He stated that the buyer probably just parked it in a garage. He told me to stop trying to intimidate them with basic GPS tracking. I did not look at him. I simply pinched my phone screen to zoom in on the map. The red dot was not blinking in a nice residential neighborhood. It was flashing right in the middle of an industrial sector in East Baltimore. I read the exact address aloud. I informed my family that my $250,000 sports car was currently sitting inside a notorious warehouse. It was an abandoned textile factory that had been raided by federal authorities twice in the past 5 years. It was a known front for a massive underground chop shop and illegal pawn operation run by the local mafia. Desmond swallowed hard. He quickly recovered and waved his hand dismissively. He insisted that the online buyer must have just been a shady character. He claimed he had no way of knowing what the guy did for a living. He said he just took the $80,000 in cash and handed over the keys. He tried to argue that the buyer criminal activities had absolutely nothing to do with him or this family. I turned to look at my father. I told him he was right about one thing. He definitely handed over the keys. But I told him he was lying about who he handed them to. Jasmine stood up from the velvet sofa. She yelled at me to stop calling our father a liar. She insisted that he was a respected real estate broker, and I was just a paranoid computer geek trying to ruin her perfect engagement night. I turned my attention back to my phone. I told them that the security system also included a hidden wide-angle dashcam. I accessed the cloud storage servers, where the car automatically backed up all footage. I pulled up the exact date and timestamp from when the vehicle was removed from Desmond Garage. A high-definition video began buffering on the massive television screen. The room grew incredibly quiet. The video started playing. It showed the dark interior of a parking garage. The camera angle pointed directly out the front windshield. We could all clearly see Desmond standing in the harsh fluorescent light. He was looking around nervously. Another figure stepped into the frame. The man was wearing a low baseball cap and a dark hoodie pulled up to obscure his features. Desmond watched the screen. He let out a nervous breath and pointed at the television. He loudly declared that the man in the hoodie was the random online buyer. He insisted the video proved his story perfectly. He told me I was wasting everyone's time and making a fool of myself for no reason. I did not say a single word. I opened a secondary application on my phone. It was a proprietary facial recognition software program that my company used to track international cybercriminals. I routed the video feed directly into the scanning software. A green targeting square appeared on this television screen. It locked onto the hooded figure face just as he handed the duffel bag of cash to Desmond. The software immediately began running biometric measurements. It analyzed bone structure, jawline dimensions, and eye spacing. Jasmine let out a nervous little laugh. She asked why the computer was putting green boxes on the screen. Connor shifted his weight. He took a slow step backward toward the hallway. He suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world, but standing in that living room. The tension in the air became thick enough to cut with a knife as the processing bar reached 99%. The software completed its scan in less than 10 seconds. A loud confirmation beep echoed through the living room. The targeting square turned bright green. A high-resolution image popped up next to the video feed. It was a 100% biometric match. The face of the shady underground buyer was displayed in crystal-clear definition for everyone to see. Connor dropped his vintage champagne glass. The delicate crystal hit the hardwood floor and shattered into 100 sharp pieces. The expensive sparkling liquid splashed violently across the polished dark wood and completely soaked into his designer leather shoes. The entire room went dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Jasmine stared at this bright television screen, with her mouth hanging completely wide open in sheer disbelief. Desmond looked like he was about to pass out. I slowly turned around to face my future brother-in-law. I stepped right up to him, closing the distance between us. I looked him directly in his panic-stricken eyes. I kept my voice incredibly soft, but it carried through the silent room like a gunshot. I asked him why a supposedly wealthy old money heir was buying stolen luxury cars from his future father-in-law, just to fence them to the dangerous mafia syndicates hidden deep within the dark and gritty Baltimore slums. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. Connor stood frozen in the center of the living room, his pale complexion turning a sickly gray. Desmond finally broke the heavy silence, stepping forward to demand an explanation. He pointed a shaking finger at the massive television screen, telling Connor to explain the flawless biometric match. He insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Jasmine rushed over to Connor, pulling him close to her chest. She yelled that I was completely fabricating the digital evidence. She claimed my software was glitching to intentionally frame her successful fiancé. She told Desmond to completely ignore my warnings because I was just a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin her perfectly planned engagement night. I did not bother to argue with her baseless accusations. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on Connor, refusing to let him look away. I told him he had exactly 5 seconds to tell his bride the truth before I personally broadcasted his hidden financial history onto the television for everyone to witness. Connor swallowed hard as sweat rolled down his right temple. He stammered out a weak defense, claiming he was just doing a favor for a distressed friend who desperately needed a reliable vehicle. His voice was shaking so badly he sounded like a frightened child backed into a corner. I tapped my phone screen once again. The image of his panicked face vanished from the television, immediately replaced by a complex financial flowchart. I spoke calmly, telling the room that men with actual generational wealth do not conduct suspicious cash transactions in dark parking garages late at night. I explained I had run a deep diagnostic scan on Connor's entire digital financial footprint. I looked at Desmond and told him, the $80,000 Connor handed him in that duffel bag did not come from any prestigious family trust fund. Desmond crossed his arms over his chest, stating that cash is cash, and it did not matter where the bills came from. I smiled coldly, turning my attention directly to my younger sister. I asked Jasmine if she had checked her destination wedding fund recently. Jasmine blinked in total confusion, asking what her private wedding fund had to do with anything we were discussing. She proudly stated she and Connor had pooled their personal resources into a joint high-yield investment portfolio. She confidently claimed Connor was actively using his elite banking connections to double her life savings right before their expensive Maldives trip. I let out a dry, mocking laugh and told her to log into her banking portal right now to verify his claims. Connor suddenly panicked, reaching out to forcefully grab Jasmine's hand before she could retrieve her phone. He frantically told her not to listen to my toxic lies, begging her to trust him blindly. Jasmine pulled her hand away from his grasp, refusing to be stopped. She unlocked her phone screen to open her bank application. The living room was completely silent, except for the sound of Jasmine's acrylic nails frantically tapping her illuminated screen. Suddenly, her breath hitched loudly, staring at her phone with wide, terrified eyes. She started tapping the refresh icon furiously, trying to force the application to show a different number, before her voice began to tremble uncontrollably. She looked up at Connor with a devastated expression and whispered that her account was completely empty down to the last single cent. She said the $80,000 she had saved was entirely gone. She asked Connor where all her money went. Connor backed away, holding his hands up defensively against his chest. He quickly lied, saying the money was securely locked in a fixed-term hedge fund, promising her the funds could not be touched for 30 days. I tapped my phone screen, bringing a bright red official bank transfer receipt directly onto the television. I pointed out the exact date and timestamp of the massive withdrawal. I showed her the $80,000 did not go into a secure corporate hedge fund. It was withdrawn in pure cash by Connor exactly 2 hours before he met Desmond in that dark garage to buy the stolen vehicle. The harsh realization hit Jasmine, making her knees buckle slightly under her weight. She realized her seemingly wealthy fiancé had actually stolen her entire wedding fund just to buy my stolen car from our father. Desmond's face contorted in sheer confusion, asking Connor why he would steal from Jasmine just to buy my sports car, since stealing $80,000 made zero logical sense. I told Desmond he was asking the completely wrong question. The real question was what Connor actually did with the luxury vehicle immediately after he bought it. A new scanned document flashed onto the television, showing a digitized copy of an underground pawnbroker illicit ledger. I had successfully hacked into the criminal syndicate private server, highlighting a specific transaction line in bright yellow. I told my father that Connor did not keep the car to drive Jasmine around in style. He took the fake title Desmond forged and drove the vehicle straight to the chop shop in East Baltimore. I read the detailed ledger entries out loud, proving beyond any doubt that Connor used my sports car as collateral for a massive underworld loan, walking out the back door with $150,000 in unmarked cash. Jasmine began to cry hysterically, asking Connor why he desperately needed $150,000 from dangerous criminals. She screamed at him, demanding to know what was truly going on, while Connor backed himself against the living room wall. He stubbornly refused to answer her pleas, so I gladly answered for him. The final digital image appeared, showing intercepted offshore betting slips and encrypted communication logs from an illegal international sportsbook operation. I loudly announced that the prestigious golden boy with the flawless old money pedigree was actually a degenerate gambling addict. I revealed Connor had carelessly lost over $400,000 betting on overseas horse races and rigged basketball games. His wealthy family cut him off completely 3 years ago, leaving him entirely broke, drowning in illicit debt while violent bookies actively threatened to break both his legs if he did not pay up. I crossed my arms over my chest, expecting them to rip him apart for his ultimate betrayal. Instead of turning their rage toward the man who had just swindled them out of $80,000, Desmond and Jasmine immediately directed their aggressive panic right back at me. Desmond violently swiped his hand across the side table, sending my expensive phone crashing onto the hardwood floor, where the screen splintered into a dozen jagged pieces. He completely ignored Connor criminal admissions and instead pointed a trembling finger at my chest. He loudly accused me of illegally stalking his future son-in-law, claiming I was just a bitter, jealous woman who could not handle seeing Jasmine marry into a high-class white pedigree. Jasmine rushed to stand in front of Connor, shielding the man who had just robbed her blind. She hysterically defended his actions, claiming he was simply experiencing temporary liquidity issues with his massive hedge fund. She screamed that I was a cold-blooded monster for exposing him in front of our father. She demanded I contact my lawyers immediately to legally transfer the vehicle title to Connor, so the dangerous pawn mafia would not break his legs over a clerical error. Connor stepped out from behind my sister, suddenly regaining his arrogant old money posture, now that he realized my family was actually foolish enough to take his side. He sneered at me, adjusting his suit jacket, and took a menacing step forward. He threatened to use his powerful family connections to completely ruin my consulting business if I dared to report the car as stolen to the local authorities. He promised he would have me blacklisted from every major corporate contract in the state of Maryland. I looked at the three of them standing shoulder to shoulder, protecting a criminal while actively plotting to steal my hard-earned assets. I did not scream or argue or defend myself against their absolute delusion. I simply turned on my heel and walked straight out the heavy oak front door, leaving them trapped in their own pathetic web of lies. The damp night air hit my face as I marched down the long paved driveway, leaving my toxic childhood home behind without a single ounce of regret. A sleek black suburban Uber was already idling quietly by the curb, waiting for my arrival. I opened the heavy back door and slid onto the cold leather seat, instructing the driver to take the fastest and most direct route back to my downtown penthouse. My mind was already shifting away from the chaotic shouting match and focusing entirely on digital retaliation. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out my secondary encrypted laptop. The high-definition screen glowed brightly in the dark passenger cabin as the powerful processor hummed to life. I typed in a highly complex sequence of alphanumeric passcodes to bypass my own standard biometric security protocols. I was not just a helpless scapegoat sister who had her dream car stolen by her greedy family. I was the chief executive officer of an elite cybersecurity and forensic accounting firm, and it was time they learned exactly what that title meant in the real world. I plugged a small encrypted communication drive into the side port of my laptop to establish a secure connection. I pulled up a heavily routed voice over internet application and dialed a restricted phone number that could not be traced by any commercial or government entity. The digital line barely rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered the call. It was Marcus, my chief financial officer and most trusted right-hand man. He asked why I was calling on an emergency secure line so late on a Sunday evening, assuming I was still resting after my grueling international flight from London. I told him there was absolutely no time for rest, because I needed to initiate a highly classified financial maneuver immediately. I instructed him to activate Protocol Alpha. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the secure connection. Protocol Alpha was a highly aggressive hostile asset acquisition strategy we usually reserved for completely dismantling corrupt offshore corporations. Marcus asked for the primary target designations, keeping his voice completely steady despite the unprecedented request. I kept my own voice low and deliberate so the Uber driver would not overhear the sensitive corporate details. I told Marcus, our first primary target was the Harrington Family Investment Group and their entire personal real estate portfolio. I instructed him to deploy our most aggressive forensic accounting algorithms to scrape every single public and private financial record tied to Connor and his supposedly elite old money white family. Marcus typed rapidly on his mechanical keyboard, and the rhythmic sound echoed softly through the phone speaker. He told me he was already bypassing their basic retail bank firewall protections and establishing a silent digital backdoor into their primary lending institutions. I watched the encrypted data stream directly onto my laptop screen as Marcus worked his magic from our downtown headquarters. The Harrington family carefully curated image of immense generational wealth and untouchable elite status began to unravel right before my eyes in lines of raw digital financial data. They were entirely out of money and actively drowning in toxic liabilities. Victoria Harrington had quietly taken out a massive third mortgage on their historic family estate just to keep up appearances and pay her exorbitant country club membership fees. Their prestigious family hedge fund was bleeding capital at an alarming rate and facing multiple quiet investigations by federal financial regulators for gross mismanagement. I told Marcus to locate every single piece of their underwater debt and package it together into a single manageable portfolio. I ordered my firm to aggressively buy up all their defaulted loans and outstanding credit liabilities through our anonymous international shell companies. I gave Marcus the second target designation of the night. I told him to completely breach the internal banking servers of Desmond Pierce Real Estate Brokerage. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, realizing I was ordering a direct cyber infiltration on my own father's private business accounts. He quickly complied without asking any unnecessary questions, knowing I never initiated these severe protocols without just cause. The financial data from Desmond corporate accounts flooded my laptop screen, illuminating the dark car interior with a harsh blue light. I expected to find standard financial mismanagement or perhaps overwhelming business loans due to a slow housing market. What I actually found was infinitely worse than simple poor business practices. I stared at the glowing red numbers on my screen, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over my entire body. Desmond was not just a failing real estate broker, drowning in bad investments and unpaid utility bills. My father was actively committing massive federal crimes on a daily basis. The forensic software highlighted a complex series of deeply hidden wire transfers, masking themselves as standard operating expenses and vendor payments. Desmond had been systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from his own clients' escrow accounts. He was actively stealing the down payments from innocent families, trying to buy their dream homes, and funneling that money into a secret personal offshore account. I instructed the software to trace the outflow of those stolen funds to see exactly where the money was bleeding out. The results made me sick to my stomach. Every single dollar was being used to fund Jasmine's lavish and entitled lifestyle. Desmond was using stolen client money to pay for her designer clothing hauls, her luxury apartment rent, and her expensive socialite networking events. He was willingly risking federal prison just to keep his golden child daughter wrapped in a complete delusion of immense wealth. I kept digging deeper into the specific timestamps of his illegal transfers, cross-referencing them with his corporate calendar schedule. I noticed a massive financial discrepancy scheduled for the upcoming Friday afternoon. A mandatory state audit was firmly scheduled for his brokerage by the housing authority regulators. He was desperately short on the stolen escrow funds, and the state auditors were going to easily discover his massive embezzlement scheme the moment they looked at the official books. Suddenly, the entire stolen car situation made perfect logical sense. Desmond did not just sell my custom Porsche because Jasmine selfishly wanted to go to the Maldives for an engagement trip to impress her fake wealthy fiancé. The $80,000 Connor handed him. In that dark parking garage was a desperate, panicked attempt to replace the stolen escrow funds before the state auditors arrived on Friday morning. My father stole my car and forged my signature to save himself from going directly to federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was staggering, but the legal leverage it now gave me was absolute. 3 days, exactly. 3 days had passed since I walked out of my father's house and initiated the financial dismantling of his entire fraudulent existence. I was sitting in my glass-walled corner office overlooking the downtown skyline, carefully reviewing the final acquisition portfolios Marcus had compiled. The State Housing Authority auditors were scheduled to walk into Desmond Brokerage in less than 48 hours to discover his massive embezzlement scheme. I was fully expecting my father to be panicking, calling my phone begging for mercy, or actively fleeing the state. Instead, the heavy glass doors to my executive suite swung open, and my receptionist walked in looking incredibly uncomfortable. She was followed closely by a man wearing a cheap gray suit carrying a thick manila envelope. He asked if I was Gabrielle Pierce. When I nodded, he dropped the heavy envelope directly onto my pristine glass desk and loudly declared that I had been officially served. I stared at the brown envelope as the process server turned and walked out of my office. Marcus, who was sitting across from me, raised an eyebrow and asked if my father had actually lost his absolute mind. I picked up the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I read the primary filing and let out a sharp laugh of pure disbelief. Desmond had not spent the last 3 days trying to replace his stolen escrow funds. Instead, he had hired a sleazy strip mall lawyer to file a massive civil lawsuit against me in state court. I read the charges out loud to Marcus. My father was officially suing me for elder financial abuse and severe emotional distress. He had fabricated an entirely fictional narrative, claiming that he had originally provided the $250,000 to purchase the custom Porsche for himself. His lawsuit boldly stated that I had manipulated an aging man into registering the luxury vehicle in my name to avoid taxes, and that his recent sale of the car to Connor was simply him reclaiming his own stolen assets. He was demanding $1 million in punitive damages for the emotional trauma I caused by threatening to call the police on my own family. The absolute sheer audacity of the man was staggering. He was actively stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent families and facing imminent federal prison time. Yet he still thought he could use the legal system to bully me into silence. I handed the lawsuit to Marcus, instructing him to forward it to our corporate legal team so they could prepare to absolutely decimate the sleazy attorney who filed it. My desk phone buzzed before Marcus could even leave the room. The receptionist apologized for the constant interruptions, but informed me that a private courier had just dropped off a priority package marked extremely urgent. She brought in a sleek silver box, tied with a ridiculous oversized white silk ribbon. I untied the ribbon and opened the box to find a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with an elaborate gold wax crest. It was an official invitation to Jasmine and Connor Grand Engagement Gala. The event was scheduled for this upcoming Saturday night at the highly exclusive Oakwood Country Club. The very same country club that Victoria Harrington used to maintain her fake high society status, despite being months behind on her membership dues. I pulled the thick cardstock invitation from the envelope, running my fingers over the expensive gold foil lettering. The invitation was sent directly by Victoria Harrington herself. It warmly invited me to celebrate the joyous union of two prestigious families coming together in perfect harmony. It was a pathetic display of fake wealth and an obvious attempt to rub my face in their manufactured happiness. They thought they had won because Desmond had filed a lawsuit to keep me quiet. They truly believed they were untouchable, and that I would just sit at home crying over my stolen car while they drank expensive champagne on my dime. But Victoria Harrington could not just send a regular invitation. Her elitist white privilege required her to add a special touch of personal humiliation, just to ensure I knew exactly where I stood in their social hierarchy. Tucked behind the formal invitation was a smaller piece of personalized stationery, written in sharp, looping cursive handwriting. I read the handwritten note out loud, so Marcus could hear the absolute delusion dripping from every single word. Victoria wrote that she was extending this pity invitation purely for the sake of family optics, because Jasmine was so kind-hearted and forgiving toward her troubled older sister. She stated that while she allowed me to attend, she could not risk my abrasive personality and unrefined computer repair job, making her high society guests feel uncomfortable during such an elegant evening. The note explicitly stated that my seating assignment had been permanently moved away from the main ballroom floor, where the important people would be dining. Victoria proudly informed me that she had assigned me a seat at the staff and vendors table located near the kitchen swinging doors. She advised me to wear something inconspicuous and to avoid speaking to the wealthy investors and corporate executives she had invited to witness her son's perfect engagement. She even added a line suggesting I should eat quickly and leave early so I would not ruin the aesthetic of their professional photographs. She wanted me to sit in the shadows and watch my sister parade around with the criminal who stole my property, all while treating me like the hired help. Marcus stared at me, his jaw clenched tight with anger. He asked if I wanted him to call the country club and have the entire event shut down right now since we legally owned the holding company that controlled the venue. I looked down at the condescending handwritten note and then back at the massive lawsuit Desmond had just served me. All the pieces were perfectly aligning on the board. They were arrogant, oblivious, and entirely trapped in a cage of their own making. I shook my head and told Marcus not to cancel anything. I told him I would not miss this engagement gala for the entire world. I slid the gold foil invitation back into its sleek silver box and smiled a cold, dangerous smile. I instructed Marcus to send a formal response card back to the Harrington estate immediately. I told him to check the box confirming my attendance and to let the happy couple know that the bride's older sister was officially saying yes to the pity invitation. The heavy oak doors of the Oakwood Country Club swung open, revealing a massive crystal chandelier that cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble foyer. I stepped over the threshold, breathing in the familiar scent of expensive floral arrangements and desperate social climbing. The valet had just taken the keys to my temporary rental car since my Porsche was currently sitting in a police evidence lot waiting to be processed. I walked with slow, deliberate steps, letting the sharp heels of my shoes echo against the stone floor. I did not wear a traditional evening gown or some fluffy pastel dress to blend in with the country club aesthetic. Instead, I chose a custom-tailored sharp black designer suit featuring a subtle emerald silk lining and a deep V neckline that projected absolute ruthless power. The cut of the fabric was immaculate, hugging my frame and forcing anyone who looked at me to immediately recognize that I was not there to play their polite little social games. I scanned the crowded foyer, watching the so-called elite members of society sipping their overpriced champagne and adjusting their diamond cufflinks. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the very ground they were standing on had been legally transferred to my corporate holding company just a few hours ago. I adjusted my jacket and prepared to walk into the main ballroom when a harsh, familiar voice cut through the ambient chatter, calling my name with unmistakable disdain. I turned my head slowly and saw Victoria Harrington marching directly toward me. She was wearing an incredibly outdated maroon sequin gown that looked like it belonged in a forgotten era of high society, trying desperately to project a level of immense wealth she simply no longer possessed. Her neck was draped in heavy pearls that I now knew were heavily leveraged against her third mortgage. Victoria stepped right into my path, intentionally blocking the grand archway that led into the main dining area. Several wealthy guests holding crystal flutes paused their conversations to watch the interaction, clearly anticipating a dramatic scene. Victoria looked me up and down, her face contorting into a mask of pure condescension. She did not bother to lower her voice. In fact, she purposely projected her words so that the small crowd of investors and local politicians standing nearby could hear every single syllable. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh, and told me she was honestly surprised I had the nerve to show up tonight considering my abrasive personality and my complete lack of social refinement. She reached into her sequin clutch and pulled out a cheap plastic badge attached to a neon orange lanyard. She held it out to me, pinching the plastic between her thumb and index finger as if it were contaminated. Victoria loudly announced that she simply could not risk my presence, making her prestigious guests feel uncomfortable during such an elegant and important evening. She stated that since my father mentioned I work in basic computer repair, she felt it was only appropriate to categorize me alongside the hired help. She shoved the plastic lanyard toward my chest, telling me that all staff and vendors were strictly required to wear identification badges at all times. She explained with a sickeningly sweet smile that the elite attendees needed to know exactly who they were dealing with, so they would not accidentally strike up a conversation with someone from the lower working class. She told me my assigned seat was located at the very back of the room, right next to the kitchen swinging doors where the catering staff took their breaks. She added a final cruel instruction, demanding that I eat my meal quickly and leave before the professional photographer arrived, because my dark suit and sullen energy would absolutely ruin the aesthetic of their perfect family portraits. The nearby guests let out soft, muffled chuckles, whispering to each other behind their hands as they watched the wealthy matriarch put me in my place. I looked down at the cheap plastic badge dangling from her manicured hand. The word vendor was printed across the front in bold black letters. I did not scream at her. I did not throw a drink in her face or demand to be treated with basic human respect. Doing any of those things would only validate her pathetic attempt to label me as an unstable, angry woman. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a cold, calculating, and utterly terrifying smile that made Victoria falter for a fraction of a second. I reached out and calmly took the neon orange lanyard from her trembling fingers. I told her that the badge was a lovely touch, and that I appreciated her taking the time to ensure everyone knew exactly who was running the show tonight. I did not put the lanyard around my neck. I unclipped the plastic badge and firmly pinned it directly onto the lapel of my custom designer suit right over my heart. I thanked her for her hospitality, keeping my voice perfectly even and pleasant. Victoria blinked in complete confusion, clearly expecting me to burst into tears or run away in shame. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but I simply stepped around her, leaving her standing in the foyer with a baffled expression on her aging face. I walked through the grand archway and officially entered the main ballroom. The space was decorated with towering arrangements of white roses and draped in sheer silk fabrics that caught the soft lighting. A string quartet was playing classical music in the corner, while waiters carrying silver trays circulated through the massive crowd. I navigated through the sea of fake wealth and empty promises, keeping my posture perfectly straight. As I walked, I spotted Jasmine holding court near the center stage. She was wearing a massive, overly complicated ball gown, covered in excessive rhinestones and cheap tulle, making her look like a desperate imitation of royalty. She was laughing loudly, hanging off Connor's arm, while he shook hands with a group of older men who looked like bank executives. Connor was wearing a crisp white tuxedo jacket, projecting the ultimate image of an untouched old money heir. They looked so incredibly proud of themselves, standing under the crystal chandelier, entirely convinced that their elaborate web of lies had successfully secured their future. They had absolutely no idea that their entire financial existence had already been dismantled and boxed up inside my secure corporate servers. I did not stop to greet my sister or my father, who was busy networking near the open bar. I walked straight past the extravagant centerpieces and the VIP tables, making my way to the very back of the sprawling ballroom. Just as Victoria had promised, my assigned seat was a small, wobbly table pushed right up against the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. There were no floral arrangements on my table and no crystal wine glasses. It was a clear, physical representation of exactly where they believed I belonged in their world. I pulled out the cheap wooden chair and sat down quietly, smoothing the fabric of my suit. The waiters rushed past me carrying heavy trays of hot food, completely ignoring my presence. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath, letting the chaotic noise of the engagement gala wash over me. I looked out across the massive room, watching my family celebrate their manufactured triumph. I watched them drink expensive liquor they could not afford in a building they did not know I owned, to celebrate a marriage built entirely on stolen funds and criminal activity. I rested my hands on the table, feeling the cold plastic of the vendor badge pinned to my chest. I was completely comfortable sitting in the shadows because I knew the spotlight was about to become an absolute interrogation lamp. I just sat there waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. The classical music playing softly in the background faded away as the crystal chandeliers dimmed to a warm, theatrical glow. A bright white spotlight suddenly illuminated the center stage at the front of the massive ballroom. Jasmine stepped up to the microphone, gripping the metal stand with both manicured hands. Her oversized rhinestone-covered gown sparkled obnoxiously under the intense lighting, making her look like a ridiculous caricature of wealth. The entire room of 300 high society guests went completely silent, waiting for the bride to speak. Jasmine looked out over the sea of wealthy investors, local politicians, and elite country club members, taking a deep, shaky breath to perfectly perform the role of an emotional and deeply grateful bride. She began her speech by thanking Victoria Harrington and the Harrington family for welcoming her into their prestigious lineage. She called Connor her absolute savior and perfect prince, claiming he rescued her from a life of constant family turmoil. Connor stood right beside her on the stage, projecting the exact image of a protective, wealthy heir. Jasmine let a perfectly timed tear roll down her cheek, gripping the microphone tighter. She lowered her voice to a dramatic whisper, telling the captive audience her journey to this beautiful engagement had not been an easy one. She falsely claimed while she and Connor were busy building a future filled with love and ambition, they were constantly dragged down by the toxic jealousy of her older sister. My sister did not use my name at first, but her eyes flicked toward the back of the room where I was sitting quietly at the vendor table. She painted a wildly fabricated narrative portraying me as a deeply bitter, unstable, unhinged woman who could not handle seeing her younger sibling achieve true happiness and elite social status. She told the crowd I was a miserable failure, spending my days working a pathetic computer repair job while hoarding intense resentment toward anyone who actually amounted to something. The wealthy guests let out soft, sympathetic murmurs, shaking their heads in pity for the poor bride who had to endure such a horrible sibling. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone and escalated her disgusting lies even further. She told the room of 300 people that my jealousy had recently mutated into outright malice. She falsely claimed I deliberately tried to steal her entire wedding fund out of pure spite because I was entirely broke and desperate for cash. She spun a horrific tale about how I tried to extort my own father and illegally seize family assets just to sabotage her dream engagement gala. She cried, performing her victim routine flawlessly, claiming Connor had to step in and use his own personal wealth to save the wedding and protect her from my toxic financial manipulation. She looked out at the audience with wide, innocent eyes, stating she was only sharing this painful family secret to highlight the incredible character and immense generosity of her future husband. The crowd let out a collective sigh of admiration for Connor, completely eating up every lie. Desmond stepped onto the stage right as Jasmine finished her tearful monologue. He wrapped his arms around his golden child and kissed the top of her head, acting like the ultimate supportive father. He took the microphone from her trembling hands and adjusted his posture, standing tall to address the elite crowd. He started his speech by publicly kissing the ground. The Harrington family walked on. He loudly praised Connor for his prestigious white old money lineage, talking about how incredibly proud he was to permanently merge the Pierce family name with the historic and untouchable Harrington dynasty. He spoke at length about the importance of strong traditional values, generational wealth, and preserving elite social circles from outside contamination. He ignored the fact that he was currently facing imminent federal prison time for wire fraud and instead puffed out his chest like a billionaire patriarch addressing his loyal subjects. He looked directly at Victoria Harrington sitting at the front VIP table and thanked her for raising a financially secure and morally upstanding son. Then my father turned his attention directly toward the back of the room. His eyes locked onto my table near the swinging kitchen doors. The spotlight did not reach me, but every person in the grand ballroom turned around in their seats to stare at the shadowy figure sitting with the hired staff. Desmond's voice echoed through the massive venue, dripping with absolute disgust and complete rejection. He officially announced to the 300 guests that as the patriarch of the Pierce family, he had to make a very painful but necessary decision. He boldly declared that he was completely disowning me in front of the entire community. He called me a total disgrace to the family name, a malicious failure, and a deeply disturbed individual who tried to extort her own flesh and blood. He told the crowd that from this moment forward, he no longer considered me his daughter, and that I was permanently banished from sharing in their prestigious future. The room erupted into thunderous applause. The elite guests clapped loudly, validating his ruthless strength for publicly cutting off a toxic family member. Connor smirked triumphantly at me from the stage, crossing his arms over his crisp white tuxedo jacket. He looked incredibly satisfied, convinced he had won the war and destroyed my reputation forever. Jasmine leaned against him, soaking in the supportive applause of the wealthy crowd. I did not run out of the room crying. I did not stand up and scream at them to stop lying. I simply sat in my wooden chair next to the kitchen doors and slowly reached into the pocket of my custom designer suit. I pulled out my encrypted mobile device and opened the secure network bypass application. I stared directly at my arrogant father and his fake billionaire son-in-law. I tapped the execution command button, sending a direct override signal straight into the country club's central audiovisual control system. The massive digital projector screen directly behind them on the stage suddenly flickered violently. The romantic photographs glitched and warped before the massive screen turned completely pitch black. The thunderous applause slowly died down as the guests noticed the technical malfunction. A second later, the screen illuminated the dark stage with a blinding white light. A single line of text appeared in massive bold black letters directly behind my smiling family. Let us talk about the money. The bright white text glared from the massive projector screen, casting a harsh shadow over my father and his fake billionaire son-in-law. Whispers immediately erupted across the grand ballroom as the 300 high society guests tried to comprehend what was happening. I pushed my wooden chair back from the vendor table and stood up, smoothing the lapels of my custom designer suit. I stepped out from the dim shadows of the kitchen doors and began my slow, deliberate walk right down the center aisle of the ballroom. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels echoed against the polished marble floor, cutting through the confused murmurs of the wealthy crowd. 2 large security guards stationed near the front immediately stepped forward to block my path, assuming I was just a rogue catering employee. I did not even slow my pace. I simply held up my encrypted mobile device, displaying the master administrative override code that identified me as the absolute owner of the holding company. The head of security blanched and quickly grabbed the other guard by the arm, violently yanking him out of my way. They bowed their heads respectfully and parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to walk straight past the front row of VIP tables. Victoria Harrington craned her neck to see what the commotion was about, and her jaw practically unhinged when she recognized my face. My father stood on the stage, squinting through the bright spotlight until his eyes finally locked onto mine. His expression of arrogant triumph instantly melted into absolute sheer terror as he realized his banished daughter was crashing his perfect moment. I did not hesitate as I reached the edge of the stage. I walked gracefully up the carpeted steps, my posture projecting complete and untouchable authority. Desmond panicked and took a clumsy step forward, desperately holding his hands up to block my path. He tried to whisper an aggressive threat, telling me to get off the stage before he had me arrested for trespassing. I did not bother responding to his pathetic bluff. I simply reached out and snatched the microphone directly out of his trembling hand with cold, surgical precision. The sudden aggressive movement caused a sharp screech of audio feedback to echo loudly through the venue, making several guests cover their ears in discomfort. Jasmine shrank back against Connor, gripping his white tuxedo jacket as if he could somehow protect her from the storm I brought into the room. I turned to face the massive crowd of elite investors, local politicians, and country club socialites. I did not scream or raise my voice in anger. I kept my tone incredibly calm and chillingly professional, measuring every single syllable for maximum psychological impact. I welcomed the esteemed guests to the engagement gala and introduced myself as Gabrielle Pierce, the older sister who was supposedly too busy working a miserable computer repair job to attend. I paused, letting my true identity sink into the minds of the wealthy attendees who had just spent the last 20 minutes listening to my family assassinate my entire character. I told the silent ballroom that while my father and sister had just spun a very entertaining fairy tale about toxic jealousy and stolen wedding funds, it was finally time to look at the cold, hard facts. I tapped the screen of my mobile device, and the massive projector behind me instantly shifted to display a highly detailed corporate financial dossier. I looked directly down at Victoria Harrington, who was sitting in the front row, clutching her heavy pearl necklace in absolute horror. I projected the Harrington family personal bank statements and real estate portfolios right onto the towering screen for all her wealthy friends to examine. I spoke directly into the microphone, telling the room that the prestigious old money lineage they were all bowing down to was actually a complete and total financial illusion. I pointed to the glowing red numbers on the screen, explaining that the Harrington family hedge fund had been completely bankrupt for over 3 years. I exposed the massive third mortgage Victoria had secretly taken out on their historic family estate just to pay her overdue country club membership dues and maintain her fake social status. The ballroom erupted into loud gasps and shocked whispers as the elite guests realized they were rubbing elbows with a family drowning in toxic debt. I watched Victoria's face turn a sickening shade of gray as her closest friends literally physically distanced themselves from her table. I told the crowd that the Harringtons were not high society royalty gracing our family with their presence. They were desperate broke frauds searching for a gullible target to fund their sinking ship, and my father was foolish enough to offer up my sister as their perfect financial life raft. I turned my attention away from the disgraced matriarch and locked my eyes directly onto Connor. The fake billionaire heir was actively sweating, his breathing shallow and rapid, as his entire world completely collapsed around him. I tapped my phone one final time, and the projector screen changed to reveal a devastating sequence of digital documents. I brought up the intercepted offshore gambling ledgers side by side with the illicit underground pawnshop receipts. I spoke clearly into the microphone, making sure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. I announced that the golden boy standing on stage did not use his vast personal wealth to save this engagement gala. I explained that Connor was a degenerate gambling addict who owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to dangerous international sportsbook syndicates. I directed everyone's attention to the bright yellow highlighted transaction lines on the massive screen. I revealed that Connor deliberately manipulated his naive dollar wedding fund. I told the horrified crowd he used Jasmine life savings to illegally purchase my stolen custom sports car from my corrupt father. I then showed the exact pawn receipt proving Connor took that stolen vehicle straight to the East Baltimore Mafia to secure a massive underworld loan just to keep his violent bookies from breaking his legs. Jasmine fell to her knees on the stage, her massive rhinestone gown pooling around her as the brutal reality of her fake perfect romance shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The 300 guests stared in complete stunned silence at the undeniable proof that the groom was nothing but a desperate common criminal. Victoria Harrington snapped out of her frozen state as the reality of her exposed financial ruin echoed through the silent ballroom. Her face contorted into a mask of pure elitist rage. She slammed her hands down on the VIP table, knocking over a crystal vase. She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face and began to scream. She frantically yelled that I was a psychotic liar who had fabricated the bank statements just to ruin her prestigious family name. She turned wildly to the other wealthy guests, begging them not to believe the digital documents glowing brightly on the stage. When the elite investors simply stared at her with expressions of sheer disgust, Victoria completely lost her fragile composure. She shrieked for the security team, demanding they immediately arrest the deranged caterer who had hijacked the stage. She yelled that I was a dangerous criminal trespassing on private property and ordered the guards to drag me out in handcuffs. Desmond grabbed my arm and hissed that I had finally gone too far. I easily twisted my arm out of his weak grasp and watched the back of the room. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and a team of 6 large security guards marched rapidly down the center aisle. They were led by the head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark suit. The wealthy guests hastily pulled their chairs in to clear a path. Connor let out a breath of immense relief, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He stepped forward and loudly instructed the guards to tackle me to the ground. Jasmine crawled up from the floor, clutching her ridiculous rhinestone dress, and sobbed at the guards to hurry up and remove the monster who ruined her engagement gala. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there holding the microphone, looking completely unbothered. The head of security walked right past my father, ignoring his outstretched hand entirely. He walked right past Connor, who was already pointing toward the exit doors. The tall guard stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for the violent removal. Instead, the head of security placed his hands neatly behind his back and bowed his head respectfully. He kept his eyes lowered and spoke into his lapel microphone, instructing the other guards to secure the perimeter of the stage. He then looked up at me and asked if I wanted the hostile individuals removed from my property. Desmond let out a bizarre choking sound, stepping back in absolute bewilderment. Connor's jaw dropped open. Victoria Harrington shrieked from the front row, demanding to know why her highly paid security staff was bowing to a pathetic computer repair technician. I slowly raised the microphone back to my mouth. The high-quality audio system amplified my calm and steady voice. I looked directly down at Victoria Harrington. I told her she could not fire the security team because she did not employ them. I explained that Oakwood Country Club had quietly filed for bankruptcy protection 6 months ago. I told the silent crowd that my corporate holding company had officially purchased the entire country club property, including all adjacent real estate, just a few hours before this engagement gala began. I turned my gaze back to Victoria. I told her that the badge she pinned on my chest earlier tonight was highly inaccurate. I was not a vendor or a catering employee. I was the new majority owner of the very building she was standing inside. I told her she was currently trespassing on my private commercial property without a valid invitation. The wealthy investors and local politicians in the audience let out loud gasps of pure shock. They began whispering furiously to one another, realizing that the quiet sister in the black designer suit held more raw financial power than the entire Harrington lineage combined. Victoria stumbled backward, clutching the edge of her table as the reality of my words crushed her fragile ego. She shook her head wildly, refusing to accept that her prestigious social kingdom now belonged to the woman she had intentionally humiliated at the front door. I pulled my encrypted mobile device from my pocket and tapped the screen once more. The massive projector behind me shifted from Connor gambling ledgers to a brand new legal document. It was a certified deed of trust, carrying the official seal of the state. I told Victoria to look closely at the glowing screen. I explained that when I ordered my firm to buy up all her toxic underwater debt, I did not just purchase her overdue country club membership fees. I also purchased the deeply defaulted third mortgage she had secretly taken out on the historic Harrington family estate. I read the legal foreclosure documents out loud to the captivated audience. I revealed that Victoria had not made a single mortgage payment in over 9 months. The bank had officially foreclosed on the property 48 hours ago, but she kept it a secret to avoid ruining the engagement gala. She desperately hoped Connor would marry into my father money so they could use Jasmine fake wedding fund to pay off the bank before the eviction notice was served. I looked down at her pale, trembling face. I told her that my anonymous international shell company had legally purchased the foreclosed debt yesterday afternoon, paying the bank in pure cash. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the massive ballroom. I leaned into the microphone and delivered the final crushing blow. I told Victoria Harrington that she was no longer a part of high society. She was not an elite matriarch running a historic family dynasty. I told her she was absolutely nothing but a desperate broke squatter, currently living illegally inside a house that I now completely owned. The words echoed off the crystal chandeliers and sank deep into the bones of every single person in the room. Victoria's eyes rolled completely back into her head. The sheer psychological weight of losing her country club, her historic estate, her son reputation, and her fake social status, all in the span of 5 minutes, was simply too much for her fragile brain to process. Her knees buckled instantly beneath her ugly maroon sequin gown. She collapsed, hitting the polished marble floor with a dull, heavy thud. The wealthy guests sitting at her VIP table shrieked and immediately scrambled backward, pulling their chairs away from her unconscious body, as if her sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. No one rushed to help her up. The elite investors simply stared down at her with expressions of total disgust and profound horror. Victoria Harrington snapped out of her frozen state as the reality of her son exposed criminal debts echoed through the silent ballroom. Her face contorted into a mask of pure elitist rage. She slammed her hands down onto her assigned VIP table, knocking over a crystal vase. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face and began to scream. She frantically yelled that I was a psychotic liar who had fabricated the digital bank statements just to ruin her prestigious family name. She turned wildly to the other wealthy guests, begging them not to believe the devastating documents glowing on the stage screen. When the elite investors simply stared back at her with expressions of sheer disgust, Victoria lost her fragile composure. She shrieked for the venue security team, demanding they immediately arrest the deranged catering vendor who had hijacked the stage. She yelled that I was a dangerous criminal, trespassing on private property, and ordered the guards to drag me out in handcuffs. Desmond snapped out of his own shock and charged toward me. He grabbed my right arm and hissed that I had finally gone too far. I easily twisted my arm out of his weak grasp and kept my eyes locked on the back of the room. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung violently open, and a team of 6 large security guards marched rapidly down the center aisle. They were led by the head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark tailored suit. The wealthy guests hastily pulled their chairs in to clear a path. Connor let out a loud breath of immense relief, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He stepped forward and loudly instructed the guards to tackle me to the ground. Jasmine crawled up from the floor, clutching her ridiculous rhinestone dress, and sobbed at the approaching guards to physically remove the monster who ruined her flawless engagement gala. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there holding the microphone, looking completely unbothered. The head of security walked right past my father, ignoring his outstretched hand entirely. He walked right past Connor, who was pointing toward the exit doors with a smug expression. The tall guard stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The entire ballroom held its breath, fully expecting a violent physical altercation. Instead, the head of security placed his hands neatly behind his back and bowed his head deeply and respectfully. He kept his eyes lowered and spoke into his lapel communication device, instructing the other guards to secure the perimeter of the stage. He then looked up at me and asked if I wanted the hostile individuals removed from my private property. Desmond let out a bizarre choking sound, stepping back in absolute bewilderment. Connor's jaw dropped completely open. Victoria shrieked, demanding to know why her security staff was bowing to a pathetic computer technician. I slowly raised the microphone back to my mouth. The audio system amplified my calm, steady voice, ensuring every person heard my next words. I looked directly down at Victoria. I told her she could not fire the security team because she did not actually employ them. I explained that Oakwood Country Club had quietly filed for bankruptcy protection exactly 6 months ago. I told the silent, captivated crowd that my corporate holding company had officially purchased the entire country club property just a few hours before this grand engagement gala began. I turned my unwavering gaze back to Victoria. I told her that the neon orange badge she maliciously pinned on my chest earlier tonight was highly inaccurate. I was not a vendor or a temporary catering employee. I was the new majority owner of the very building she was currently standing inside. The wealthy investors in the audience let out loud gasps of pure shock. They began whispering furiously, realizing that the quiet sister in the black designer suit held more raw financial power than the entire Harrington lineage combined. Victoria stumbled backward, clutching the edge of her wet table as the reality of my words crushed her fragile ego into dust. She shook her head wildly, refusing to accept that her prestigious social kingdom now belonged entirely to the woman she had intentionally humiliated at the front doors. I pulled my encrypted mobile device from my pocket and tapped the screen once more. The massive projector behind me instantly shifted to a brand new complex legal document. It was a certified deed of trust, carrying the official red seal of the State Housing Authority. I explained that when I ordered my firm to buy up all her toxic underwater debt, I also purchased the deeply defaulted third mortgage she had taken out on the historic Harrington family estate. I read the harsh legal foreclosure documents out loud, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I revealed that Victoria had not made a single mortgage payment in over 9 consecutive months. The primary lending bank had officially foreclosed on the luxury property exactly 48 hours ago. But she kept the eviction a desperate secret to avoid ruining the engagement gala. She desperately hoped Connor would marry into my father money tonight, so they could eventually use Jasmine fake wedding fund to pay off the bank before the sheriff served the eviction notice. I told her my anonymous shell company had legally purchased the foreclosed debt yesterday afternoon, paying the bank in pure cash. I leaned slightly into the microphone and delivered the final crushing psychological blow. I told Victoria Harrington she was absolutely nothing but a desperate broke squatter, currently living illegally inside a house that I now completely owned. The cold, ruthless words echoed off the crystal chandeliers and sank deep into the bones of every single person in the room. Victoria's eyes rolled completely back into her head. The sheer psychological weight of losing her prestigious country club, her historic family estate, her son reputation, and her fake elite social status, in 5 devastating minutes, was simply too much for her fragile brain to process. Her weak knees buckled instantly beneath her ugly maroon sequin gown. She collapsed, hitting the polished marble floor with a dull, heavy thud. The wealthy guests sitting at her VIP table shrieked and immediately scrambled backward, pulling their chairs far away from her unconscious body. No one rushed forward to help her up. The elite investors simply stared down at her limp form with expressions of total disgust and profound horror. Connor did not rush forward to help his mother, who was currently lying unconscious on the polished marble floor. He stood completely frozen in his expensive white tuxedo, staring at the crumpled heap of maroon sequins before slowly turning his terrified gaze back to me. His perfectly styled hair was now disheveled and the crisp white jacket suddenly looked like a very cheap and pathetic costume. The suffocating reality of his absolute public ruin finally cracked his carefully manufactured old money facade. His chest heaved as he pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. He yelled that I had absolutely no right to dig into his private financial affairs, claiming I was just a vindictive, jealous outsider trying to drag my beautiful sister down to my miserable working-class level. He desperately tried to spin the rapidly collapsing narrative for the remaining elite guests, shouting that my digital documents were entirely fabricated by a bitter sibling who wanted to ruin his pristine reputation. But the wealthy investors and local politicians simply turned their backs on him, whispering furiously among themselves about the immense fraud they had almost invested their own corporate money into. The total and immediate rejection from his elitist peers pushed Connor completely over the psychological edge. The fake polished gentleman instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cornered, vicious, and highly desperate criminal. His pale face twisted into a horrific mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He let out a guttural scream of raw rage and aggressively lunged directly at me with a tightly clenched fist drawn back to strike my face. He shouted a vile and deeply offensive racially charged insult, telling me that arrogant black trash like me had absolutely no right to step into his prestigious world and destroy his superior bloodline. He yelled that I should have stayed in the dirty ghetto where I truly belonged, instead of playing dress-up with my little computers. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward or raise my hands to protect myself from his impending physical violence. I simply stood my ground, maintaining my perfect posture, and watched the pathetic man charge blindly at me before his expensive leather shoe could even touch the first carpeted step of the center stage. A massive dark shadow moved with terrifying speed from my peripheral vision. The head of security intercepted Connor mid-stride before he could even come close to touching my designer suit. The tall, broad-shouldered guard did not just stop the physical attack, he completely neutralized the imminent threat with brutal and highly trained professional efficiency. He grabbed Connor violently extended arm, twisting it sharply and painfully behind his back, while simultaneously kicking the back of his knees with heavy combat boots. Connor let out a sharp, high-pitched yelp of intense pain as his legs buckled instantly beneath his weight. The security chief slammed the arrogant fake air face first directly into the polished hardwood of the stage floor. The heavy, sickening impact echoed loudly through the completely silent ballroom. The guard pressed his thick knee firmly right between Connor's shoulder blades, pinning him completely and utterly to the ground, while effortlessly holding his twisted arm in a debilitating physical lock. Connor thrashed wildly against the hard floor, grunting and cursing as he struggled pathetically against the massive weight, but he was entirely trapped and unable to move a single inch. Desmond stood completely frozen in sheer shock, unable to process the violent and humiliating takedown of his highly prized future son-in-law. Jasmine let out an ear-piercing shriek of pure unrestrained panic. She scrambled frantically across the stage in her ridiculous oversized rhinestone gown, completely ignoring the devastating digital evidence still glowing brightly on the massive projector screen behind us. She dropped to her knees right next to Connor's pinned and restrained body and began hysterically pulling at the security guard's dark suit jacket. She screamed at the stoic guard to let her innocent fiancé go, crying, tears of heavy mascara down her face, while claiming he was hurting a highly respected and important man. She turned her tear-stained face up to look at me, her eyes filled with absolute toxic venom and blind denial. She yelled that I was a cold-blooded monster for intentionally setting him up to fail. She stubbornly insisted that Connor was just an unfortunate victim of bad business partners, and that he truly loved her more than anything else in the entire world. She desperately claimed his minor financial mistakes meant absolutely nothing because their profound romantic connection was completely real and entirely unbreakable. I looked down at my weeping sister, feeling absolutely zero pity or sympathy for the arrogant woman who had happily mocked the malicious theft of my property just a few short days ago. I decided it was finally time to completely and permanently shatter her pathetic romantic delusion. I told Jasmine that if she was so incredibly confident in his profound love, she needed to hear exactly how he spoke about her when she was not standing right next to him feeding his massive ego. I raised my encrypted mobile device and tapped the screen to interface directly with the country club's massive surround sound audio system. I opened an intercepted digital audio file I had forensically pulled from Connor's highly unsecured cloud storage servers. I told the silent crowd that this was a recorded phone call between Connor and his illegal underground sports bookie from exactly 48 hours ago. I pressed the execution button on my screen and let the harsh, unedited audio blast through the premium ballroom speakers at maximum volume, ensuring no one could miss a single word. Connor's voice echoed loudly through the room, completely devoid of his usual charming and sophisticated cadence. He was aggressively arguing with the dangerous bookie, begging and pleading for just a few more days to successfully secure the necessary cash. The rough, threatening voice on the other end of the line asked how a broke kid was going to come up with $150,000 by Friday afternoon. Connor let out a cruel, condescending, and incredibly malicious laugh on the recording. He proudly boasted to the criminal that he had just secured the ultimate gullible fool in Desmond Pierce. He blatantly called my father a desperate, pathetic old man who was so incredibly eager for white high society validation that he practically handed over the keys to his own daughter's luxury car without asking a single intelligent question. The bookie asked about the upcoming wedding and the naive bride. Connor laughed even harder, calling Jasmine a clueless, desperate sugar mama who was way too obsessed with taking photos for the internet to even notice he was actively draining her entire life savings account. He explicitly stated he was only keeping her around until the wedding gift checks officially cleared so he could pay his massive debts and disappear into the night. The audio recording clicked off, leaving a deafening and totally devastating silence hanging heavily over the grand ballroom. The wealthy guests stared in absolute unblinking horror at the completely crushed family standing on the stage. Connor stopped struggling against the security guard, completely defeated and humiliated by his own recorded words. Desmond's face contorted in sheer agonizing realization, knowing he had eagerly sacrificed his own flesh and blood for a racist con artist who viewed him as nothing but a pathetic, easily manipulated joke. Jasmine slowly pulled her trembling hands away from Connor's constrained shoulder. Her entire body began to shake violently as the brutal, indisputable truth finally penetrated her thick skull. The precious golden child who had spent her entire privileged life believing she was completely untouchable and vastly superior to everyone else, suddenly realized she was nothing but a cheap, highly disposable financial pawn. She slumped forward, collapsing entirely onto her hands and knees, crushing the expensive tulle of her dress. Her perfectly curated ego was completely and utterly destroyed beyond any hope of repair. She buried her ruined face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably, mourning the death of her fake prestigious future. The wailing sound of heavy sirens suddenly pierced through the suffocating silence of the grand ballroom. The noise grew louder and more aggressive by the second, echoing off the perfectly manicured grounds outside the country club. Flashes of harsh red and blue emergency lights began to pulse violently through the towering frosted glass windows, casting an eerie strobe effect over the panicked faces of the elite guests. Jasmine stopped crying for her own ruined future and slowly turned her head toward the grand entrance. The reality of the approaching sirens finally registered in her deeply delusional mind. She let go of Connor's restrained shoulder and scrambled across the carpeted stage right to my feet. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored designer suit. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her ruined face, begging me to turn off the massive projector screen, still displaying their extensive criminal records. She hysterically pleaded with me to make the bad things go away, promising she would completely call off the engagement right now if I just let them leave. She cried that we did not need to involve the authorities over a simple family misunderstanding. She desperately claimed that we could just pack up our things, get in my rental car and drive straight back to our father house in Maryland. She promised we could order takeout, sit in the living room, and fix this entire mess together like a real family. She promised to finally be the good little sister I always wanted her to be if I just used my immense wealth and power to protect them from the police. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, truly believing that a few fake tears and a hollow promise of sisterhood would be enough to erase the massive federal crimes her fiancé and our father had willingly committed. I looked down at her hands gripping my suit jacket, and I felt absolutely nothing. I did not feel an ounce of the familial obligation she was desperately trying to exploit. I slowly reached down and peeled her acrylic nails off my clothing one by one. I took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between myself and her pathetic manipulation tactic. I kept my voice completely devoid of any emotion as I looked down at my weeping sister. I told her she was completely failing to grasp the sheer magnitude of the situation she was currently trapped in. I explained that Desmond did not just steal a few $1,000s from a faceless corporate bank. I reminded her that he systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent working-class families just to buy her designer shoes and fund her lavish influencer lifestyle. I told her that the federal government does not simply forgive wire fraud because a spoiled girl wants to go home and eat takeout. I looked directly into Jasmine's eyes and delivered the absolute final blow to her manufactured reality. I told her there was no home to go to anymore. I explained that the moment my forensic accounting firm verified Desmond's massive escrow theft, we were legally obligated to notify the Federal Housing Authority and the Financial Crimes Division. I told her that while she was busy trying on expensive wedding dresses and sipping vintage champagne, the government had officially frozen every single one of Desmond's personal and business bank accounts. I revealed that federal agents had already seized the historic family estate in Maryland, placing bright yellow notice tape across the heavy oak front doors exactly 2 hours ago. They were completely broke homeless and entirely out of options. Desmond let out a horrific sound that was halfway between a gasp and a physical dry heave. The absolute reality of losing his prestigious real estate firm, his comfortable mansion, and his entire carefully crafted identity hit him with the force of a freight train. He wildly looked around the stage, searching for any possible exit route. He took a desperate lunging step toward the side stairs, hoping to slip out through the catering kitchen and disappear into the night. The head of my private security team did not even break a sweat. He simply shifted his weight and extended his massive arm, completely blocking the exit path. He placed his heavy hand firmly against Desmond's chest, forcing my father to step back onto the center stage. My father was completely trapped with nowhere left to run and no one left to manipulate. Before Desmond could attempt another pathetic escape route, the heavy wooden double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst violently open. The loud crash caused several wealthy guests in the back row to scream and jump out of their chairs. A highly coordinated team of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back, marched rapidly into the elegant room. They were accompanied by several uniformed local police officers and plainclothes financial crimes detectives. The elite high society guests immediately scrambled out of the way, pulling their expensive silk dresses and tailored tuxedo jackets clear of the center aisle. The agents did not care about the immense wealth or the political status of anyone standing in that room. They moved with absolute ruthless purpose, their eyes locked directly onto the brightly lit stage where the criminals were currently standing. The lead federal agent, a tall, stern-looking man with a deeply lined face, walked straight up to the edge of the stage. He completely ignored the terrified gasps of the remaining investors and the crying socialites hiding behind their overturned tables. He did not ask for permission to interrupt the grand engagement gala. He looked up at the massive projector screen still displaying the irrefutable evidence of illicit offshore gambling debts and embezzled escrow accounts. He gave a short, sharp nod of confirmation to his partner before turning his hard gaze directly toward my father and the fake old money heir pinned to the floor. The agent reached into the inner pocket of his tactical windbreaker and pulled out a thick stack of folded legal documents carrying the official seal of the federal court system. He announced his presence loudly and clearly, ensuring his voice carried to every single corner of the silent ballroom. He stated that his task force was executing multiple federal arrest warrants, targeting the leadership of the Pierce Real Estate Brokerage and the Harrington Family Investment Group. The ultimate reckoning had finally arrived right at their feet, and there was absolutely no escaping the cold, harsh reality of the law. The lead federal agent did not lower his voice to spare my father any embarrassment. He stepped directly onto the carpeted stage and pulled heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He looked down at Connor, who was still pinned against the hardwood floor by my head of security. The agent read from the official warrant stating that Connor Harrington was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He listed the charges clearly for the entire silent ballroom to hear: grand larceny, auto theft, interstate wire fraud, and direct financial involvement with a known organized crime syndicate. Connor finally managed to lift his bruised face from the floor and frantically tried to pull rank. He sputtered out his prestigious family name, claiming the officers were making a massive mistake. He insisted that his father played golf with the mayor and that men of his social standing do not get arrested in the middle of their own engagement galas. The agent simply let out a dry, humorless laugh. He told Connor that his family name held absolutely zero currency with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My security chief stepped back, allowing two uniformed officers to haul the disgraced fake heir to his feet. They yanked his arms roughly behind his back, and the cold metal cuffs clicked shut over the sleeves of his expensive white tuxedo jacket. Connor winced in pain as the officers tightened the restraints. His old money arrogance completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic, trembling criminal who finally realized his web of lies had entirely collapsed. He looked frantically toward his mother for help, but Victoria was still lying unconscious near the scattered ruins of her front row VIP table. The wealthy investors just stared at him with total revulsion, backing away as the officers marched him toward the main exit doors. His entire life of unearned privilege ended the moment those doors shut behind him. Desmond watched his perfect future son-in-law get dragged away in sheer horror. He slowly backed toward the edge of the stage, holding his hands up defensively. He tried to deploy his usual smooth-talking real estate broker charm, attempting to negotiate with the federal agents. He flashed a nervous smile and claimed he was just a completely innocent victim in this entire situation. He lied right to the agent face, saying Connor had aggressively manipulated him into selling the luxury vehicle. He insisted he had absolutely no idea the young man was involved with the underground mafia or illicit chop shops. He begged the agents to let him go home, promising he would happily come down to the station tomorrow morning to give a full witness statement against Connor. The lead agent did not entertain my father, pathetic performance for a single second. He pulled a second set of warrants from his windbreaker and stepped right into Desmond's personal space. He told my father that the Bureau was not currently interested in his involvement with the stolen Porsche. He explained that the Financial Crimes Division had been secretly monitoring his corporate brokerage accounts for the past 72 hours. The agent read the new charges loud enough to make the remaining real estate clients in the room gasp in pure shock. He announced that Desmond Pierce was formally under arrest for 27 counts of felony embezzlement wire fraud and the systematic theft of client escrow funds. The agent detailed how my father had illegally siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent families just to buy designer handbags and luxury vacations for his youngest daughter. The color completely drained from my father's face. His confident posture crumpled as two officers grabbed his arms and forced them behind his back. The sound of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the quiet venue. Desmond began to hyperventilate, shaking his head in absolute denial. He looked out at the crowd of people he had spent years trying to impress. He saw his former real estate clients whispering furiously to one another, realizing their hard-earned down payments were entirely gone. His carefully constructed image as a wealthy, successful patriarch was permanently destroyed in front of the exact high society crowd he worshipped. He was no longer the powerful man who could casually disown his daughter to score social points. He was just a desperate thief caught red-handed in a borrowed tuxedo. Panic fully consumed my father as the officers began to pull him toward the stage stairs. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the carpet, refusing to walk. He whipped his head around and locked his desperate eyes directly onto me. He saw me standing there in my immaculate designer suit surrounded by my highly trained private security detail. He finally processed the indisputable fact that I possessed more liquid capital than everyone in that country club combined. His pride completely vanished, replaced by raw, pathetic desperation. He yelled my name across the stage, begging me to help him. He pleaded with me to use my immense corporate wealth to post his bail tonight, so he would not have to sleep in a cold federal holding cell. He promised he would pay me back every single cent if I just saved him from this public humiliation. I did not move a muscle to help him. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the man who had gladly thrown me to the wolves just to protect his golden child. I kept my voice entirely void of any emotion or familial warmth. I told him that respect is not something you can purchase with stolen money when you are cornered by the FBI. I reminded him that just 30 minutes ago he stood on this exact same stage and publicly declared that I was a miserable failure who did not belong in his prestigious family. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and delivered the final absolute truth. I told him he sold my car to buy a lie. I advised him to consider his bail money officially spent. Desmond let out a devastated sob as the reality of my cold rejection broke his spirit. He sagged heavily against the police officers, and they dragged him down the steps, marching him out the heavy doors. The lead federal agent did not lower his voice to spare my father or his fake billionaire son-in-law any public embarrassment. He stepped onto the center stage and pulled heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He looked down at Connor, who was still pinned against the hardwood floor. The agent read from the official warrant stating that Connor Harrington was being placed under immediate arrest. He listed the severe charges clearly for the silent ballroom to hear: grand larceny, auto theft, interstate, wire fraud, and direct financial involvement with a known organized crime syndicate. Connor managed to lift his bruised face and frantically tried to pull rank. He sputtered out his family name, claiming the officers were making a massive mistake. He insisted his father played golf with the state governor and that men of his elite white social standing do not get arrested in the middle of their own engagement galas. The federal agent let out a dry, humorless laugh. He told Connor his supposedly untouchable family name held zero currency with the FBI. My security chief took a step back, allowing two uniformed officers to haul the disgraced fake heir to his feet. They yanked his arms roughly behind his back, and the metal cuffs clicked shut over the sleeves of his white tuxedo jacket. Connor winced in sharp pain as the officers tightened the restraints. His arrogant old money facade completely evaporated, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling criminal who finally realized his elaborate web of lies had entirely collapsed. He looked frantically toward his mother for help, but Victoria was still lying unconscious near the scattered ruins of her VIP table. The wealthy investors stared at him with total revulsion, backing away as the officers marched him toward the main exit doors. His life of unearned privilege ended the exact moment those heavy doors shut behind him. Desmond watched his perfect future son-in-law get dragged away in sheer unbelievable horror. He slowly backed toward the edge of the stage, holding his trembling hands up defensively. He tried to deploy his usual smooth-talking real estate broker charm, attempting to desperately negotiate with the federal agents. He flashed a nervous smile and claimed he was a completely innocent victim in this situation. He lied right to the lead agent face, saying Connor had aggressively manipulated him into selling the luxury vehicle. He insisted he had absolutely no idea the young man was involved with the dangerous underground mafia. He begged the agents to let him go home, promising he would happily come down to the local precinct tomorrow morning to give a full witness statement against Connor. The lead agent did not entertain my father's pathetic theatrical performance for a single second. He pulled a second set of warrants from his windbreaker and stepped right into Desmond's personal space. He told my father the Bureau was not currently interested in his minor involvement with the stolen Porsche. He explained the Financial Crimes Division had been secretly monitoring his corporate brokerage accounts for the past 72 hours. The agent read the new federal charges loud enough to make the remaining real estate clients in the room gasp in pure shock. He announced Desmond Pierce was formally under arrest for 27 counts of felony embezzlement, wire fraud, and the systematic theft of client escrow funds. The agent detailed how my father illegally siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent working families just to buy designer handbags and luxury vacations for his entitled youngest daughter. The color completely drained from my father's face. His confident posture crumpled instantly as two officers grabbed his arms and forced them aggressively behind his back. The sharp metallic sound of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet venue. Desmond began to hyperventilate, shaking his head back and forth in absolute blind denial. He looked out at the massive crowd of people he had spent years trying to impress and manipulate. He saw his former real estate clients whispering furiously to one another, realizing their hard-earned down payments were entirely gone. His carefully constructed image as a wealthy, successful patriarch was permanently destroyed in front of the exact high society crowd he worshipped with his entire being. He was no longer the commanding man who could casually disown his eldest daughter. He was just a desperate thief caught red-handed wearing a borrowed tuxedo. Blind panic fully consumed my father as the police officers began to physically pull him toward the stage stairs. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the carpet, refusing to walk cooperatively. He whipped his head around and locked his desperate, terrified eyes directly onto me. He saw me standing there in my immaculate designer suit, perfectly surrounded by my highly trained private security detail. He finally processed the indisputable fact that I possessed more liquid capital and raw corporate power than everyone in that country club combined. His stubborn pride completely vanished, replaced by raw, pathetic desperation. He yelled my name across the stage, begging me to use my influence to help him. He pleaded with me to use my immense wealth to post his bail tonight so he would not have to sleep on a concrete bench inside a cold holding cell. He promised he would pay me back every single cent if I just saved him from this ultimate public humiliation. I did not move a single muscle to help him. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the man who had gladly thrown me to the wolves just to protect his spoiled golden child. I kept my voice entirely void of any emotion or familial warmth. I told him respect is not something you can purchase with stolen client money when you are cornered by the federal government. I reminded him that just 30 minutes ago he stood on this exact same stage and publicly declared I was a miserable failure who did not belong in his prestigious family tree. I looked directly into his terrified wide eyes and delivered the final absolute truth that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I told him he sold my car to buy a lie. I advised him to consider his bail money officially spent. Desmond let out a devastated, gut-wrenching sob as the cold reality of my rejection broke his spirit. He sagged heavily against the police officers, and they dragged him down the steps, marching him out the doors to a waiting squad car. The heavy metal doors of the East Baltimore warehouse crashed open under the sheer force of a synchronized federal raid. I sat in my corner office watching the live encrypted tactical feed provided by my liaison at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The task force moved with ruthless precision, sweeping through the notorious chop shop before the underground syndicate members could even attempt to scrub their illegal digital ledgers. My mobile phone buzzed on the glass desk. It was the lead detective confirming what the drone footage was already showing me. My Porsche 911 Turbo S had been located, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp. The vehicle was completely intact without a single scratch on the pristine paint job the syndicate had been waiting for counterfeit registration papers to clear before stripping it down for high-value parts. Connor desperate pawn transaction had been so sloppy that the mafia quarantined the vehicle, assuming it was a monitored police trap. They were, ironically, completely right. The detective informed me the car would be released from the evidence impound within 48 hours, once the forensic team pulled the internal dashcam footage to solidify the massive racketeering case against the local mob bosses. I thanked him and terminated the secure connection feeling deep satisfaction. The physical recovery of my stolen property was just the first phase of the corporate battlefield I had meticulously prepared for the upcoming week. I immediately turned my attention to the mountain of digital financial dossiers spread across my desk network. Marcus walked into the room carrying legal authorizations signed by a federal bankruptcy judge. I had officially been granted full operational control over Desmond Pierce's entire corporate and personal portfolio, because my cybersecurity firm had preemptively bought up all of his toxic commercial debt and assumed control of the stolen vehicle insurance liens. I was legally recognized as his absolute primary creditor. I did not hesitate to exercise that immense financial power. I instructed Marcus to initiate immediate total asset liquidation. We systematically dismantled my father, failing real estate brokerage piece by piece, selling off the commercial office leases, the remaining company vehicles, and the physical office equipment to the highest corporate bidders. The liquid capital generated from the fire sale was not funneled into my firm holding accounts. I directed every generated penny into a secure recovery fund designated for the innocent working-class families my father had defrauded. My forensic accounting team worked around the clock mapping out the exact dollar amounts missing from the various escrow accounts we orchestrated. A massive digital restoration process wiring the stolen down payments directly back to the devastated homebuyers who thought their entire futures had been destroyed by a corrupt broker. The restitution process completely drained whatever equity Desmond had left. We seized his private bank accounts, his retirement portfolios, and the remaining equity in his estate to cover the vast deficit caused by his embezzlement. When the digital dust finally settled on Thursday afternoon, the financial reality was absolute. My father possessed a net worth of precisely $0. He was stripped of his broker license, his reputation, and his entire safety net, leaving him entirely at the mercy of a ruthless federal judge with a heavily mandated public defender who had zero interest in hearing his pathetic excuses. The devastating financial ripple effect immediately struck my younger sister with unrelenting force. Jasmine woke up on Friday morning to find all of her supplemental credit cards officially declined. Desmond could no longer illegally funnel stolen client money to cover her exorbitant lifestyle expenses. The management company of her downtown apartment building posted a formal eviction notice directly onto her front door. Since her rent was 2 months in arrears, she attempted to call my office 27 times, leaving hysterical voicemails begging for a loan to keep her designer clothes from being thrown onto the sidewalk. I instructed my receptionist to permanently block her number across all our corporate communication channels. Jasmine had laughed joyously when she thought my hard-earned wealth was stolen to fund her fake elite status. Now she had to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of actual poverty. Without a single safety net to break her rapid fall, she was relegated to the exact working-class struggles she had spent her entire life mocking. The final loose end of the intricate corporate web required my personal physical attendance. I left my downtown headquarters on Friday afternoon and took a private car directly to the historic Harrington family estate. The sprawling mansion looked incredibly bleak, completely stripped of its false high society prestige. Two local sheriff deputies were already standing on the massive front porch, holding the official court-ordered eviction documentation. Victoria Harrington was standing on the front lawn, wearing a faded silk robe, shivering in the breeze. She was surrounded by a pile of cheap cardboard boxes containing whatever personal items the court allowed her to retain. The bank had seized all the valuable antiques, the imported rugs, and the expensive artwork to cover the defaulted third mortgage I had purchased. She looked up as my sleek black car pulled into the circular driveway. Her hollow, sunken eyes widened in pure terror when she saw me step out of the vehicle holding a master ring of keys. I walked up the stone pathway, stopping just a few feet away from the disgraced matriarch. The deputies tipped their hats, acknowledging my legal status as the new owner of the sprawling property. Victoria opened her mouth, letting out a broken, raspy sound, trying to formulate some kind of arrogant defense or pathetic plea for mercy. I held up my hand to stop her from wasting my time. I told her the locks were being changed in 5 minutes, and any garbage left on the front lawn would be incinerated. Before sunset, I looked at the broken woman who had confidently handed me a plastic vendor badge just a few nights ago, intending to humiliate me in front of her wealthy friends. She was now completely homeless, entirely bankrupt, and carrying her entire ruined life in a few damp cardboard boxes. I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I turned my back on her and walked up the stone steps to unlock the heavy front doors of my new real estate acquisition, leaving her standing alone in the cold to figure out how to survive in a world where her old money lineage meant absolutely nothing at all. Exactly 365 days have passed since I walked down the stone steps of the Harrington estate, leaving a broken matriarch shivering in the cold, damp evening air. The low, powerful growl of the twin-turbo engine vibrates smoothly through the leather steering wheel beneath my hands. I am driving my custom Porsche 911 Turbo S straight down the busiest avenue in downtown Baltimore. The vehicle is in absolute pristine condition without a single smudge on the gleaming metallic paint. It smells like expensive leather and total victory. I pull up to the secure underground parking garage of a towering 60-story glass skyscraper. The security gate automatically scans my license plate and the heavy metal barrier lifts instantly. I am not parking in a borrowed space today. I drive the luxury sports car directly into the premier executive parking spot reserved exclusively for the chief executive officer. My cybersecurity firm has aggressively expanded over the past 12 months, acquiring 2 major competitors and securing massive federal contracts. I step out of the vehicle, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored emerald green designer suit. My chief financial officer, Marcus, meets me at the private executive elevator holding a tablet loaded with our morning briefings. We step into the glass elevator, and the doors slide shut, sealing out the noise of the underground garage. The elevator shoots upward, climbing higher and higher above the bustling city streets. As the digital floor numbers flash above the elevator doors, Marcus updates me on the final legal proceedings regarding my former family members. The federal justice system moves slowly, but it strikes with absolute devastating precision when it finally lands. Desmond Pierce is no longer wearing custom-tailored suits or drinking vintage champagne in a suburban mansion. My father was officially convicted on 27 counts of wire fraud and grand embezzlement. The federal judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy during the sentencing hearing, noting his complete lack of remorse and his blatant willingness to sell his own daughter property to cover his crimes. Desmond is currently serving a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years inside a medium-security federal penitentiary. He spends his days doing menial kitchen labor and sleeping on a thin mattress surrounded by cold concrete walls. His carefully constructed image of an elite real estate mogul is entirely dead and buried. The state revoked his broker license permanently, ensuring he can never legally touch another real estate transaction for the rest of his natural life. Connor Harrington met an even harsher fate. The federal prosecutors linked his illicit underground pawn shop transaction directly to a massive interstate organized crime syndicate. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for grand larceny, auto theft, and racketeering. The prestigious Harrington family name is completely synonymous with fraud and absolute disgrace. Victoria Harrington tried to move into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of the city, but she was quickly shunned by every single person in her former high society circle. Her fake elite empire collapsed into nothing but embarrassing local gossip and unpaid utility bills. The elevator chimes softly as we reach the top floor of the glass skyscraper. I step out into the expansive reception area of my corporate headquarters. The space is sleek, modern, and buzzing with highly paid tech professionals securing global financial networks. I walk down the pristine hallway and think about the golden child who once mocked my career as a pathetic computer repair job. Jasmine Pierce is no longer planning lavish destination weddings in the Maldives or trying on expensive rhinestone ball gowns. When Desmond's assets were entirely liquidated to repay the innocent families he defrauded, Jasmine was violently thrust into the brutal reality of the working class. She was evicted from her luxury apartment, and her leased car was repossessed by the bank. She is currently living in a cramped, dark studio apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood, completely cut off from the endless stream of stolen money she used to survive. My security team recently ran a routine background check on her, just to ensure she was not attempting to breach our corporate networks. The report showed that the former aspiring socialite is now working a grueling minimum wage retail job at a fast food drive-through window. She spends her days wearing a greasy polyester uniform, handing cheap paper bags of food to annoyed customers. There are no more wealthy investors to manipulate and no more golden child privileges to exploit. She has to wake up every single morning and face the exhausting reality of actually working for a living, just like the people she spent her entire life aggressively looking down upon. She is entirely alone in the world with no father to fund her delusions and no fake billionaire fiancé to elevate her social status. I push open the heavy double doors to my private corner office. The room is massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city skyline. The morning sun is shining brightly, reflecting off the glass buildings and casting a warm glow over my pristine mahogany desk. I walk over to the massive window and look down at the tiny cars navigating the busy streets far below. I have built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up without a single drop of support from the people who were supposed to protect me. I rest my hands against the cool glass and take a deep, steadying breath. The air in my office smells like fresh coffee and absolute freedom. I think about the night I walked into my father's house dripping wet from the rain, only to find him celebrating the malicious theft of my property. I think about the sheer arrogance in their eyes when they told me to accept my place at the bottom of their twisted hierarchy. They expected me to bow my head and quietly absorb the abuse just to keep the peace. They thought my silence in that living room was a sign of total submission and pathetic weakness. They did not know my silence was a highly calculated strategy. I look out over the sprawling city, and I know exactly who I am. Loyalty to toxic blood is a deadly poison dressed up as family tradition. The people who demand your blind obedience are usually the exact same people actively digging your grave. You do not owe your success to anyone who tried to build their fake empire on top of your broken back. I smile as the sunlight warms my face. I did not just take back my custom sports car that night. I took back my entire life. The story of Gabrielle's confrontation with her family serves as a powerful testament to the idea that true influence is not derived from social pedigree or family ties, but from raw competence and unshakable integrity. At its core, the narrative is not merely a tale of revenge, but a masterclass in why entitlement is a self-destructive force. The primary lesson learned from Gabrielle's journey is that people who rely on deception and unearned privilege to sustain their lifestyles inevitably create their own downfall. Her father Desmond and her sister Jasmine lived in a manufactured reality, assuming that their family status granted them the right to exploit Gabrielle's hard work. They viewed her success as a resource to be tapped rather than a result to be respected. This mindset blinded them. Because they believed their own lies about being part of an elite world, they failed to recognize that they were dealing with someone who had built a genuine empire from the ground up. Gabrielle's success highlights the second crucial lesson: Technical mastery and cool-headed analysis are the most effective forms of protection. When faced with betrayal, many would have reacted with impulsive anger or emotional outbursts. Instead, Gabrielle utilized the same skills that fueled her professional success to systematically dismantle the illusions her family relied upon. She proved that when one possesses the capability to understand the truth, whether through forensic accounting or cybersecurity, no amount of social posturing can hide the reality of deceit. Furthermore, the story illustrates the fragility of relationships built on transaction rather than genuine connection. The antagonists viewed their lives as a series of negotiations where they always expected to come out on top. When their financial foundation collapsed, they had no actual substance to fall back on. They were not just bankrupt in terms of money, they were bankrupt in character. Gabrielle, by contrast, had built a life defined by her own achievements. When she walked away from her toxic childhood home, she did not lose anything, she merely shed the dead weight that was holding her back. Ultimately, the lesson is clear: do not build your life on the hope that others will provide for you or protect you. Relationships that demand blind obedience are toxic, and wealth that isn't anchored in hard work and honesty is inherently unstable. By focusing on your own growth and maintaining a high standard of professional integrity, you cultivate a form of power that no one can steal or forge. When you are competent, you are never truly vulnerable because you possess the tools to navigate any storm and, if necessary, build something better from the wreckage of a life you have outgrown. Stop waiting for others to validate your worth. Invest in your own skills today. Build your independence and ensure your success is something that cannot be taken away.